Okay, let's say our La'asok B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch
Yes.
atah Adonai
Adonai,
Eloheinu
Eloheinu
melech
melech
haolam
haolam,
asher
Asher
kidshanu
Keshanu
b'mitzvotav
Mitzvotav,
v'tzivanu La'asok
La'asok
B'divrei
B'divrei
Torah.
Torah.
Praise to you, Lord of God, rule of the universe, who's made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. All right. So at the last minute, I decided to add some embalming to the matter because that is a related topic, and hopefully we'll get to that this evening as well. We begin with a picture of a burial cave in Israel dating to the 5th century BCE, and in a juxtaposition that you get frequently in Israel, there is one of the modern Israeli highways very close to it. So this shows that burial has been going on for a very long time. This would be 5th century BCE, would be after the return of the Jews from the Babylonian exile. So during the Persian period.
That raises a small question. Was Sarah the first to be buried, as far as we know?
She is the first recorded burial.
I guess that's what I meant.
Yes. It's a fair question. All right, so on one foot, our summary, cremation is the act of burning a body after that person has died. So there are separate questions regarding whole body burial versus cremation, and then what happens if somebody gets cremated anyway, and then their family wants to bury them in a Jewish cemetery. So related but separate questions. Starting with the Torah's perspective on these matters. The key text that all of the discussions reference is from Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, there's a section about people who commit capital crimes. And it says that you should give them the death penalty, which is a whole separate class. But then, even though they are a criminal who did this heinous act, you then bury the body the same day. Because it is an affront to God to let them be just like displayed there with their dead body hanging there for everybody to see. So, and the idea here has to do with not desecrating a body that was created in the image of God. And so, kal v'chomer, meaning all the more so, if a criminal is to be buried promptly, then it is reasoned by people looking at this verse that everybody else should also get buried, and as soon as possible. That is the key text that everybody refers to. The other texts that are relevant here. So we have one about how you, from Genesis, after Adam and Eve mess up, and God says to them that you will have to work for your food until you die and return to the ground, because dust you are and to dust you shall return. So on the surface of this, that could be seen as a pro-cremation text, because after your body is burned, then it's ground up. Sorry if that was a surprise. And so the ground up bones are kind of dust-like. On the other hand, they don't decompose because all the organic matter has been burned off. So they don't return to the dust from which you were taken. Or they don't go back into it. I guess they could sit there. So you could also look at this as not a pro-cremation text. Another key text is what we are reading this coming Shabbat, which is why I timed this class for this week, from Parshat Chaye Sarah, where Abraham's wife Sarah dies, and Abraham negotiates with the people who live in the area to buy a cave to bury her, the cave of Machpelah. So, since it doesn't say that first he burned her body and then he buried her, it is reasonable to assume that this is a whole body burial text. Okay, when Jacob dies, he asks that his children bury him in that same cave. And we find out at this point that that cave is where Abraham and Sarah are buried, Isaac and Rebekah are buried, and Leah is buried, and Jacob wants to be buried there as well. So we see that burial is a important way to go, or you're already gone, way to be dealt, for your body to be dealt with after you died, for our patriarchs. All right, at the end of the Torah, Moses dies, and I'm sorry if that was a spoiler for anybody. And it says that God buried him. Nobody knows where. Now we know from earlier in the Bible, when Aaron's two sons offer unauthorized sacrifices in Leviticus, that God is capable of burning bodies, because that's what happens to them. But it doesn't say that God burned Moses' body. It just says God buried his body. So again, it is reasonable to assume that Moses was buried there. Questions so far about our Torah text before we get into the rest of the Bible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. When we in the portion when Korach and his
Mm-hmm.
and his followers, confront Moses, they bring out their pans.
Yeah.
And God, just he doesn't burn the people. I mean, he has them go into a crevasse, basically, that's created, and the pans become holy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I'm right. I never understood that that Aaron's sons were burned, just that they died.
The first two, only the first two.
I'm sorry?
The first two.
Yeah. Nadav and
yes. So there is the fire that consumes not Korach himself, but the other people who are with him. This is the slightly less known part. Chapter 16 of Numbers, verse 35. I don't have this memorized. I just have a chumash next to me. And a fire went forth from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. So there's that text, and I'll find the other story for you. 1 second. Now, okay, Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1. Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord alien fire, which God had not enjoined upon them. And a fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the Lord. So yes, God is capable. Thank you for reminding me of the Korach story. I'd forgotten about that one. So yes, God is capable of burning people if God so chooses.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. other questions about our Torah texts?
David,
Yeah.
I just put in the chat, my sister is actually in Israel right now, and she went to Hebron, and she went to the Machpelah.
Cool.
I was wondering about that.
Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
All right. Let's go on to the rest of the Bible. This is where it gets more interesting. So, in the book of Joshua, after the Battle of Jericho, the Israelites are told not to loot the city.
Ça y est, pourquoi tu enlèves?
And
This
À
they,
chaque fois que je viens, tu enlèves.
somebody, wait.
all right. So, the Israelites are told not to loot the city. And if they do, then bad things will happen. And someone does. And they figure out who it was. And first he's stoned to death. And then he is put in the fire. So his body is getting burned after he has died. And it seems like this is not good. That's our first text. From Amos. So Amos is a prophet. He's one of the 12 minor prophets. And he goes on I don't want to call it a prophesizing rant, but he has a set of prophecies against various nations and then also against the kingdom of Israel. And he says, because you did this bad thing, these bad things will happen to you. And for the kingdom of Moab, which is in modern day Jordan, the reason that bad things are going to happen is because the king of Moab burned the bones of the king of Edom, which is another kingdom in Jordan. So it seems from this text that burning the bones is not a good thing to do. Then we get to 1 Samuel and slightly complicate things. So King Saul is the first king of the Israelites, and he dies in battle fighting the Philistines. And the Philistines take him and his 3 sons, who also die in this battle, and they hang them up on the wall of one of their cities. And some allies of the Israelites march all night and rescue the bodies, and they burn them, and then they bury the bones. And so here, well, there is some uncertainty about what exactly is getting burned, and there's another version in Chronicles later in the Bible that doesn't say anything about burning, just that the bodies are buried. Here it looks like burning the bones is a sign of respect. So maybe there's a differentiation between burning as a desecration of the body versus burning as honoring the dead. Somewhat similar in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet, has his own book, lived around the time of the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. And he is telling the last king of Judah that he will die peacefully, even though the Babylonians are attacking. And as burnings were burned for his ancestors, there will be burnings that are burned for him. So again, it's not clear whether this is incense that is burned, which is entirely possible based off of a simple reading of this text, or his body that is burned after he has died. But it seems like this is a burning that is done to honor the body. Few more texts, and then we'll sum up, and then we'll take questions. So Ezekiel, another prophet, prophesizing during the Babylonian exile. This, in this particular case, is prophesizing against Tyre, which was where the Phoenicians were based in modern-day Lebanon, and because they were dishonest in their trading, God made a fire come and devour the city and reduce it to ashes in the ground. So it seems here that having a fire devour you is not a positive fate. All right, then we get Malachi. Malachi is the last of the prophets. He's prophesying after the Israelites have returned or have had the chance to return from Babylonia under the Persians. This reading is part of the Haftorah that we do the Shabbat before Passover, known as Shabbat HaGadol, because a few verses later, after the text that we have here, it talks about Elijah coming to announce the coming of the Messiah. So here we see that all of the arrogant and the doers of evil shall be burnt like straw, and they will burn to ashes, and nothing will be left of them. So again, seems that burning to ashes is not a positive fate. So we'll do a recap, then we'll take questions. Recapping both sections, so now the entire Bible, people should be buried, whether they are criminals or patriarchs or matriarchs. Burial is done out of honoring the dead who are created in the image of God. Even God uses burial when needing to deal with a body. And unless you are doing it out of honoring the body, burning bodies either leads to bad things or is a punishment for bad things. All right, questions so far?
This is Diane.
Yeah.
It's kind of a question because it's something I've struggled with, actually. If you read the comments, we cremated my mother, and there were things. So when we cremated my mother, I mean, we went through the whole entire normal burial process, with the exception that instead of burying the body, we buried ashes. So we went through the whole, service thing. Now, and I think the reason that we chose that originally was because that's what my mother wanted. So, but this is something I've struggled with. So in our case, it was, she's buried, she has a headstone, the whole 9 yards. But one thing that was a dilemma for my sister and I is my third sister. She wanted to split up the ashes instead of bury them. And that was a huge dilemma. Well, fortunately, it wasn't a dilemma because my other sister and I had the executor role and we were able to make the decision. But, that's a dilemma when you do cremate, because I believe there are legal cases now where people can take people to court and actually sue to get part of the ashes. And to me, that's kind of bizarre, having somebody spread all over, like in 50 different places and that sort of thing. So I'm just and it's a dilemma that I have with the whole cremation process, because I had never thought of that beforehand.
Yes. So that is the two sides of one particular coin of this whole coin collection, so to speak. On the one hand, you can split ashes, which sometimes is a helpful thing when a family is united in going down the cremation path. On the other hand, when you don't want to split, when some people want to, but other people don't want to, then the fact that you can split ashes becomes a negative thing. So yeah, thank you for raising that as both a pro and a con. It's hard.
I have a naive question.
Yeah.
Going back to Abraham, when he was told to sacrifice his son, would he
Mhm.
have burned him and made ashes out of Isaac? And what would have happened at that point?
Yeah.
What would be different? I mean, he'd have to dispose of that leftover body in some way.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it looks like Cindy has an answer in the chat. Yes, Isaac was to be a burnt offering,
But nonetheless,
killed first and then fully burned up.
Yes,
So I think the Bible sidesteps this question by saying, actually, the answer that we are trying to give is that you just don't sacrifice people in the first place.
right,
Um,
the side of it, obviously, but
yeah.
okay.
So
our forefathers.
Popped into my mind as we were talking.
yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, if you take the case of Isaac, the Bible's answer is he should be as we've seen, as he was buried, not through being bound up and killed and then burnt, as we read about last week.
I have a, thank you.
Naomi.
I have a question about the last statement, and maybe I'm just misreading it. Unless you are doing it out of honoring the body, burning bodies either leads to bad things or is a punishment. But if somebody dies and you want to honor him, it's saying that it's okay then.
From looking at the biblical sources.
I'm just reading this sentence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is summarizing what we've seen so far of the biblical sources.
Okay.
So we saw that that Saul's body, there was a situation where Saul's body was burned before it was buried. And the text seems to be okay with that. There are different explanations given as to why it was burned, such as that the flesh was decomposing, and so it seemed like an honor, an act of respect to bury him at that point after having burned his body and then just leaving the bones. Whereas if it hadn't been if his body had been in better shape, then they might not have done it. The other thing here is that the bones were still buried. They were not ground up in the way that cremation happens now. Which part of that is this is just a modern phenomenon, but we work with what we have biblically. Does that help at all?
Sort of.
Okay.
I have a question. In the first picture that you showed of a burial site, were any bones found in there? Were there any remnants that would indicate?
I don't know, but I assume that the archaeologists had reason to believe that there was that it was a burial site. I don't know the story behind it, but I trust that they were able to accurately identify it. But it's a good question.
David?
You mentioned You mentioned the Philistines with the burning, the burn.
Mm-hmm.
Forget the exact. And you thought maybe they were burning incense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to whether the fact that we burn a candle, which has not got any aroma to it, as far as I'm aware,
Mm-hmm.
would that be an extension of burning incense?
Hmm.
The 7-day candle?
Yeah. I think it depends on why the incense was being burned.
Why,
The incense
why is
might
the
have.
candle being burned?
So the candle's being burned as a way of. It's connected to a verse that I'm blanking on the exact wording, but something about the soul is compared to a candle. And there are other layers of meaning, like the light of that person's life and whatnot. That the incense was probably burned because before they had refrigeration for bodies, human bodies held up okay if they were buried within 24 hours. If they were buried to be around longer before refrigeration meant that things were going to start to get smelly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a good question.
May I offer an opinion?
Please.
It seems to me, with due respect, that incense burning and candle burning could be seen as two distinct and separate things. For example, there is an incense burning in the Holy Temple, or even in the Mishkan in the Holy Temple. We burn incense, and there is a whole formula of what the incense is to be. On the other hand, there's burning of candles, and that's called, and the candelabra is called the menorah, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have the cups at the top, and they put in the wicks and the oil, and they burn those. That's burning candles, so to speak. So I see them as, my due respect is, I don't see them as related to each other, incense and candles. I see them as the two different things because they're dealt with separately in Torah as incense and candles. What I don't see is if either one is directly in the text related to the soul. I will greatly exceed that it's likely to be in commentary and opinions, but I don't see any text that says that either the incense or the candles are related to the soul when they're being burned.
Interesting.
That's
So,
purely my opinion. And one other related aspect, if I could ask, I'm blanking on the process when the blood is drawn out of the body and the fluid is injected.
Embalming.
Embalming. You mentioned embalming in the beginning, David.
Yeah.
And the one and only example I know of in the text is Yosef Hatzadi
Mm-hmm.
in Egypt. He gets embalmed and he gets buried, if you will, in a casket at the bottom of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we? It's before Torah, so we don't have any issues about actual Torah law regarding Yosef. And then, of course, he was the viceroy of Egypt, so we don't have a clear-cut ability to say that he shouldn't have been done then, because he was embraced by the Egyptian people as being a great savior of their people to avoid the famine. But is there a consensus as to whether or not we haven't heard embalming yet? Is it yet to come? That's the question I should ask.
Embalming is yet to come.
Okay, then I'll stop my statement and we'll go from there.
Great.
Thanks.
All right.
So David.
Yes, sir.
The main argument I've heard against cremation is reincarnation. And if you burn the body, it can't be reincarnated. But if it is not burned, then the bones can be brought to life again, if you will, covered with flesh.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's quite the same thing as bringing a human being back, but
Mhm.
I
Haftorah,
mean, we have
dry
that
bones.
story in the Bible. So the
Uh-huh.
question is,
Haftorah.
how was that resolved within Judaism?
So I chose to not bring that argument in this text, in the source sheet. And to me, now this is my opinion, I'm sure there's a text somewhere that supports it. If God can do a 248 piece puzzle, so to speak, and put bones together and then add flesh, then to me, God can do a 2 million piece puzzle and reassemble the bone fragments and put flesh on them. So
If they're not scattered.
if they're scattered,
And
God's
so what
got
if
some
they
more
are?
work to do.
Yeah. What if they are?
So I did not bring that argument either way.
Okay.
I'm sure there's a text that supports what I have to say, and I have not had this particular discussion with anybody to get their counter arguments.
I'm sure there are many discussions in Talmud about it or someplace. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So at this point, I'm going to move a little faster, and hopefully we'll have time for questions before the end. So now we're going to look at the post-biblical sources. In the Mishnah, there's a tractate called Avodah Zarah, which is about idol worship. And it says that if there is a death that involves public burning, then this counts as idol worship. Because Jews don't do that. And in fact, the Roman historian Tacitus, or Tacitus, however one pronounces his name, who lived around the time that the Mishnah was being written, wrote in his histories that the Jews, quote, bury rather than burn their dead. So that was what was going on at the time of the Mishnah. In Sanhedrin, so now we are in Talmud, in the Gemara. Sanhedrin is a tractate about criminal law. And here we see that when the Torah says, you shall certainly bury deceased criminals, and it doubles the word bury, then this is now elevated to a transgression. If you have not buried somebody that it is in your power to bury after they are dead, then that is a problem. How they would feel about burying ashes is a slightly more nuanced question. And then this becomes one of the 613 commandments, that of burying the dead, and is listed in other places that list the commandments. Maimonides, Sefer HaChinuch, the Shulchan Aruch, and so on. All right, also in Sanhedrin, a page later, we see there's a question about when does mourning begin, or the obligation of mourning begin, and it is said that it comes from the time of the sealing of the grave cover. So here we get one of the issues that comes up with cremation and burial, or specifically scattering of ashes versus burial. That when you bury, and here I'm going to speak as somebody who has not, thank God, had to do this to a close relative yet. It is my understanding that the sound of the earth hitting the coffin provides some finality that, yes, this is real, this has happened, and possibly also provide some closure for some people. that might not happen in exactly the same way if you have ashes that are not buried. Moed Katan. So this is another section of the Talmud that talks about mourning practices, among other things. And here we see that when people who had a lot of money died, their burial processions would be very elaborate and their coffins would be very elaborate. And this was embarrassing to people who didn't have enough money. And so the decision was made by Rabban Gamliel, who was the head of the community and had enough money to have an elaborate procession, that he should just be taken out in a plain garment, in plain linen garments. And so everybody else was like, okay, well, if he's going to go with that route, then I guess we should do this too, so that the community can get along and people are not embarrassed. And so today, the traditional Jewish practice is that everybody should be buried in a plain pine coffin. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it cuts down on the cost. One of the biggest argument for cremations is that they are less expensive than funerals, than burial, which is true. However, if you go with the simple plain pine coffin, that gap is much smaller. The second argument for cremation is that they are better for the environment, which we'll come back to. But one of the reasons that that argument is made is because oftentimes there are metal caskets or there are rare woods that are used for fancy coffins. And so a Jewish funeral, traditional Jewish funeral, is designed to be better for the environment. The casket decomposes much faster, and also not as expensive. And that comes out of this text from the Talmud. In the Mishnah Torah, so this is Maimonides in the 1100s, reorganizing the Talmud to make it easier to find things. Maimonides says that if somebody says, "Don't bury me," and then they die, you have to disregard them and bury them. Because the Torah says you should bury people. So this touches on the question of what do you do if a parent says that they want to be cremated and the family members who are left don't want to cremate them. The conversation is more nuanced than just this one text, but this text from 900 years ago touches on this conversation going on today for many families. Also in the Mishnah Torah, we see that you bury the corpse with its face upward, and you may bury it in a wooden coffin, which gets to the practice of green funerals, where you don't have a coffin at all. And this text suggests that there might be some support for that in Jewish tradition. The Shulchan Aruch, which is the major law code from 1563, says that if you place your deceased in a coffin but do not bury them in the earth, you have transgressed the prohibition of leaving them overnight unburied, and it is good to bury them in soil even outside of Israel. So this touches on the question of if you have somebody's ashes, does it make a difference if you bury those ashes or not? And as we will see with the arguments for burial, burying the ashes and putting up a gravestone of some sort does touch on some of those questions. All right. Also in the Shulchan Aruch, there's a discussion about what you can and cannot do on Shabbat. And in general, you don't carry things on Shabbat, particularly in the public area. However, if there is a body lying in a place where it could get burned, then you should carry it on Shabbat, because we don't want to burn bodies, dead bodies, according to the Shulchan Aruch. If you can carry it in a non-normal way to show this is Shabbat, great, but better to just get it out of the way so that it doesn't get burned. So that would be what the Shulchan Aruch is saying about. It's not exactly the same, but it's relevant. Here, one could argue that this is an unplanned cremation, I guess, and a desecration of the body if the person didn't want to be cremated. So you could see this as either an anti-cremation or a neutral on the question of cremation, but definitely anti-accidental cremations text. Okay, recognizing the time, I think I'm going to keep going, and then I'll stick around for questions. So, if Jewish tradition is firmly anti-cremation, or seems that way, then what are the arguments for cremation? And I'll say now what I should have said at the beginning, which is that my goal in this class is not to tell anybody that what they are doing is wrong, and not to judge you. It is merely to show what tradition says and give you more information should you want to make a choice in this area. So with that, why do some Jews want cremation? So the biggest reason is that it's less expensive, as we talked about. $1,000 to $3,000 for cremation, $8,000 to $10,000 for burial. Second reason is ecologically friendly. Other reasons that are given for preferring cremation: not taking up space in cemeteries. It is seen as being easier in surviving family members. It's less complicated. There's more flexibility in timing for memorial services. Not liking the idea of lying in the ground or decaying after death, and more options for what happens with the ashes. You can scatter them in a specific spot, you can make them into art, or as Diane said, you can divide them among loved ones. So these are the pro-cremation arguments, according to funeral home websites, non-Jewish funeral home websites. Now, the reasons not to cremate. So and again, some of these can be dealt with by burying cremated ashes with a headstone. So the first reason has to do with permanence. It is easier for many people, I'm not going to say for everybody, but for many people, to feel loved one's presence when there's something permanent, rather than an ephemeral spirit that might be there in a place where ashes were scattered years before. Also, if you're planning on scattering ashes, there are regulations in many places where these things happen, so you should investigate. If you keep an urn of ashes around to try to just maintain that sense of permanent presence, urns do get lost or broken in a way that gravestones do not get misplaced during a moving process. Also connected to this sense of permanence is the value that future generations not yet born might find in the information on a gravestone. So today I heard somebody saying that they needed to prove that they were Jewish in order to get married in Israel. And the way that they had to prove that was taking a picture of a maternal ancestor's gravestone to say, look, she had a Hebrew name, she had a yortzeit on her gravestone, like she's Jewish and therefore I'm Jewish through my maternal line. Genealogical records on papers get lost, and those on the computer might become unreadable as technology advances. If you remember the floppy disk or LetterPerfect, for instance. So such as myself in my family might be interested in knowing about a previous generation in their family and getting information that you can't get from an urn, but you can get from a tombstone. There's also ecological reasons for not cremating. Crematoria use huge amounts of fossil fuel and release a whole slew of toxic substances into the air. So if you're concerned about air pollution when you're alive, then it seems hypocritical to create air pollution when you're dead. And instead, it is better ecologically for your body to bring the nutrients back into the earth by decomposing. And the fact that cemeteries take up space is exactly the benefit, because green space can be hard to find in cities as more and more space gets taken up by buildings. And then finally, the idea of bodies being created in the image of God. And if you want to treat your body respectfully, then one way to do that might be to treat it the way that we treat a Torah that can't be used anymore, by burying it. And then there's the biggest reason for many people, which is the Holocaust. So for that, I have brought a selection from Night, which I'm not going to read in the interest of time, but you can read it when I send this out tomorrow, God willing. All right. Here is a video. I'm not playing it now. You can play it later. It lays out a lot of the same things I've talked about. It has some new things I have not talked about. So you can look at that. Okay, then there's the question of what actually happens during a cremation. So I'm not going to go through this now. If you're considering cremation, you should really know what happens. It's a little gross, but you should probably find out what happens. At least I find it gross. All right. If somebody wants to be cremated but have their ashes buried in a Jewish cemetery, then it depends on who you ask, both for the funeral and for the burial. Most Orthodox authorities will say no. No to the funeral, no to the burial. The United Synagogue of London's Burial Society, which is Orthodox, if they're in a coffin. Conservative rabbis and Reform rabbis will most likely officiate at a memorial service, particularly if the body is present before it's cremated. And there are rulings that you can read through if you're particularly interested. Okay, 5 minutes left. Let's talk about embalming. So the short answer about embalming is that it is kosher, so to speak. It is okay if necessary for transportation, if the body's not being buried in 3 days. Or if it's crossing state lines. So it's better to bury promptly, and we want the body to return to dust sooner than the up to 100 years that it can take for embalmed bodies to decompose. And in traditional Jewish funerals, nobody is seeing the body in an open casket. So we don't have the argument of we want it to look better so that people will have a better last impression. So it turns out that there are 2 biblical figures that are embalmed. One is Jacob. And is the father of Joseph, among others. Joseph was the second command of Egypt. And it was Egyptian practice to embalm bodies. So we can see this as Jacob was embalmed because government regulations required it. It would seem disrespectful for the second in command of Egypt to not embalm his own father's body. Then we have Joseph. The last verse in the entire book of Genesis, Joseph dies, he is embalmed, and he's placed in a coffin. And since prior to that, he had requested that his body be buried in the land of Israel when the Israelites left, some indeterminate time in the future. His body was embalmed, and we could see this as being embalmed because of transportation over long distance and length of time until burial. So I brought a few texts, Guide to Religious Practice by Isaac Klein, which basically says, generally no, but if you need to do it for to honor the dead and because of time until burial or distance until burial, then that's okay. And if blood is drawn out, blood should be kept and then buried with the body. The Jewish Mourner's Book of Why also talks about embalming, so you can read that here. The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning, which is considered the text by many people, has a long thing. The too long didn't read version is usually forbidden with good reason, but sometimes it's okay with specific reasons. So you can read that here as well. Again, the reasons that are considered to be okay: lengthy delay in the funeral service, that's unavoidable; burial to take place overseas, or when governmental authority demands it. Usually, and all of these are because of health regulations. Okay, then we have the appendices. So, Appendix A, there were a set of questions asked of a cross-denominational board of Jewish rabbis during World War II. One of them had to do with cremated soldiers, cremated by the Japanese. They were prisoners of war who died. And can those ashes be buried in a Jewish cemetery? The answer is yes, because they didn't have a choice in the matter. And then also a question about embalming, which they said, like, the question was, do we have to keep track of the blood as well as the body? And the answer was, this is war, don't worry about keeping track of the blood. Appendix B, 10 reasons for ground burial in alphabetical order, A through J. Appendix C, Orthodox takes on cremation. Appendix B, conservative takes on cremation. Appendix E, Reform takes on cremation. That's a long one. Appendix F, other articles about cremation, My Jewish Learning, the forward, and so on. And then Appendix G, cremation in the Encyclopedia Judaica. Took a picture for you and typed up the part about the burial of ashes. And finally, Appendix H, other relevant texts that I did not want to work in, but thought ought to be kept in case you were interested. So that was a lot. I'm going to stop the share and the recording.
David, do you ever sleep?